What if the HOA that made your life a living nightmare for years never actually owned the land they used to control your entire neighborhood? One man found that exact loophole, and what he did next left an entire HOA board completely speechless. There are people in this world who simply want to live quietly. They want to mow their grass on a Saturday morning, sit on their porch with a cup of coffee, and watch the neighborhood settle into a slow, peaceful weekend. Marcus Hale was exactly that kind of man. He was a retired civil engineer in his late 50s, methodical by nature, patient almost to a fault, and deeply committed to the idea that if you followed the rules and respected your neighbors, life would return the favor. For the first 2 years after he moved into Pinecrest Estates, that belief held up just fine. The neighborhood was well kept, the streets were clean, and the homes were the kind of solid, sturdy construction that Marcus appreciated after decades of working in structural design. He had chosen Pinecrest deliberately. He had done his research, reviewed the HOA documents, read every covenant, and decided it was a fair trade. Modest monthly dues in exchange for a maintained, orderly community. He was not the kind of man who looked for trouble. He was the kind of man trouble eventually found anyway. The first sign came in the form of a letter. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, crisp white envelope, HOA logo in the upper left corner, formal language inside. Marcus had left his recycling bin at the curb approximately 4 hours past the approved collection window. The fine was $40. Marcus paid it without argument, moved his bin, and assumed that was the end of it. It was not the end of anything. Over the following months, the letters kept coming. His garden hose was the wrong color and visible from the street. His truck, a perfectly legal, registered vehicle, was parked 2 inches over the edge of his driveway onto the grass. His mailbox post needed repainting. His motion sensor porch light activated too frequently and constituted a nuisance to unspecified neighbors. Each fine was between $20 and $60. Each notice was signed by the same name, Sandra Whitmore, HOA board president. Marcus had seen Sandra Whitmore exactly once at a neighborhood meeting, and the impression she left was not subtle. She was the kind of person who had discovered that a small amount of institutional power could be stretched into something that felt like total authority over other human beings, and she had committed to that discovery completely. She spoke about HOA regulations the way some people speak about constitutional law, with absolute conviction that the rules she enforced existed to preserve something sacred, and that anyone who questioned them was an enemy of the community. Marcus began attending board meetings. He raised concerns politely, calmly, with the measured tone of a man who had spent decades navigating bureaucratic systems. He asked why enforcement seemed concentrated on certain properties. He asked for clarification on how violations were reported and documented. He was told, in increasingly clipped language, that the board operated transparently and that his concerns were noted. They were never addressed. By the end of his 3rd year at Pinecrest, Marcus had paid nearly $900 in HOA fines. He had not once violated a rule he considered remotely significant. He had trimmed his hedges to the regulation height, repainted his fence in the approved color palette, and replaced his mailbox post entirely. Still, the letters came. It was a conversation with his neighbor, a retired attorney named Douglas, that changed the direction of everything. Douglas had lived in Pinecrest for 11 years and had watched the HOA tighten its grip incrementally over time. Over coffee one afternoon, he mentioned almost offhandedly that the original Pinecrest development had been built in phases and that the county land records from the early development period were famously disorganized. He had always wondered, he said, whether anyone had ever actually audited the property boundary documentation from the original subdivision filing. Marcus heard that sentence and felt something shift in the way his mind was organizing the problem. He spent the next 3 weeks pulling records. He requested the original subdivision plat from the county recorder's office. He obtained the HOA's articles of incorporation, its property deed filings, and every boundary survey on record for Pinecrest Estates. He spread them across his dining room table and went through them the way he had once gone through structural blueprints, systematically, precisely, looking for the thing that did not match. He found it on a Wednesday evening in early October, at the entrance to Pinecrest Estates, where the main road transitioned into the private neighborhood street, where the decorative stone pillars stood and the HOA had recently been discussing installing a community gate. There was a gap, not a large gap, not something that would have been obvious to anyone not actively looking. It was a 1-foot wide strip of land running approximately 60 feet along the entrance corridor. It was not included in the HOA's property deed. It was not included in any individual homeowner's lot description. It was not part of the county road right-of-way. It was unowned land, forgotten land, a surveying artifact from the original subdivision filing that had simply fallen through the administrative cracks decades ago and never been corrected. Marcus sat back in his chair and stared at that gap in the records for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Douglas. The conversation was short. Douglas confirmed what Marcus had found. He also confirmed something Marcus had suspected but needed a legal mind to verify: that unclaimed land of this type, with no active ownership claim and no right-of-way designation, could be purchased from the county through a straightforward, quiet title process. Marcus did not tell anyone else what he had found. He did not post about it online. He did not confront Sandra Whitmore or appear at a board meeting with documents in hand. He hired a quiet, efficient real estate attorney, filed the necessary paperwork with the county, and waited. 6 weeks later, Marcus Hale became the sole legal owner of a 1-foot strip of land running directly across the only entrance and exit to Pinecrest Estates. And then he started making plans. Marcus was not a dramatic man by nature. The installation happened on a Friday night. Marcus had contracted with a licensed gate company 2 counties over, specifically choosing a firm with no connections to anyone in Pinecrest. The crew arrived at 10 in the evening, worked through the night under proper lighting, and by 5:30 Saturday morning the job was complete. A heavy-duty automated security gate now stood precisely on the boundary of Marcus's newly acquired 1-foot strip of land. It was bolted, wired, code-compliant in every respect, and operated by a keypad and remote system that only Marcus controlled. It was beautiful work, and Marcus stood at his window with his morning coffee and looked at it with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had just solved a very complicated problem. The first resident to encounter the gate was a woman named Patricia who left early for her weekend farmer's market shift. She pulled up to the entrance at 6:15, found the gate closed, entered no code because she had no code, and sat in her car for several minutes before reversing and going back home. By 7 in the morning, 3 more cars had piled up at the entrance. By 8, there were 11. By 9, Sandra Whitmore had arrived in her bathrobe. Word spread through Pinecrest the way word always spreads in tightly wound communities. Instantly, completely, and with a level of alarm that was somewhat disproportionate to the actual inconvenience, though in this case the alarm was perhaps warranted. Residents gathered near the gate in small clusters, phones out, photographing the structure and comparing notes. Someone had already posted in the neighborhood's private online group. The thread had 47 replies within the first hour. Sandra Whitmore spent the better part of Saturday morning on her phone. She called the county. She called the HOA's property manager. She called the gate company, who politely confirmed they had done nothing wrong and referred her to the property owner. When she finally called Marcus directly, he answered on the second ring, calmly confirmed that yes, the gate was his, on his land, installed legally, and that he was happy to discuss access arrangements at a mutually convenient time. Sandra Whitmore had not become HOA board president by accepting that kind of answer. By noon she had contacted 2 attorneys. By 3 in the afternoon Marcus received a letter, delivered personally to his door by the HOA's property manager, demanding immediate removal of the gate on the grounds of interference with community access rights. Marcus read the letter carefully, set it on the dining room table next to his property deed, and called his own attorney. The legal position Marcus occupied was extraordinary. His ownership of the strip was recorded, filed, and clean. There was no easement on record granting the HOA or any resident a right-of-way across his land. The gate was permitted, code-compliant, and structurally sound. He had not blocked a public road. He had not violated any criminal statute. He had simply installed a gate on his own property. Every attorney who looked at the case in those first 72 hours arrived at the same conclusion. Marcus was untouchable. He did, however, want to be reasonable. On Monday morning, Marcus sent a formal letter to the HOA board. It was professional, clearly written, and outlined 3 options. The first option was a permanent easement purchase, a one-time payment that would grant the HOA the right-of-way across his strip in perpetuity. The price was $120,000, significantly less, Marcus noted, than what the property was worth in terms of its functional value to the community. The second option was a monthly licensing arrangement, in which residents would have gate access for a recurring fee, with Marcus maintaining full ownership and control. The third option was for the HOA to pursue litigation, which his attorney had already advised would be both expensive and unsuccessful. He gave the board 10 days to respond. The community response was not what Sandra Whitmore had expected. The residents of Pinecrest Estates had watched their HOA board fine Marcus for a garden hose and a recycling bin and a mailbox post for 3 years. Several of them had their own histories with the board. Several more had simply observed and said nothing, because the board had not yet focused its attention on them, and silence had seemed like the path of least resistance. Now they were reading Marcus's letter, which he had shared publicly in the neighborhood group, and they were doing the math. The HOA had approximately $84,000 in its reserve fund. The easement price was $120,000. The gap between those two numbers was not small, and filling it would require a special assessment, meaning every homeowner in Pinecrest would receive a bill. The board, which had spent 3 years collecting fines and issuing violations, was now going to have to ask those same homeowners to pay extra to fix a problem the board's own negligence had created. The board meetings that followed were the most heavily attended in Pinecrest history. Sandra Whitmore, who had run those meetings for years with calm, absolute authority, found herself on the other side of the table for the first time. Homeowners who had never raised their voices in a public meeting raised them now. Questions were asked that did not have comfortable answers. How had the property records never been audited? How had the entrance land ownership never been confirmed before the gate discussion began? Within 60 days, 2 board members had resigned. Sandra Whitmore announced she would not seek re-election at the end of her term. The HOA negotiated a final easement agreement with Marcus, not at the original price, but at a figure that still represented a significant and permanent acknowledgement that he held the power in this arrangement and had chosen to be generous with it. Marcus had his easement fee deposited directly into a fund he set up for neighborhood beautification projects, the kind of genuine community improvement that nobody had bothered to prioritize when they were too busy measuring mailbox heights and timing recycling bins. He never received another violation letter. He still had his morning coffee on the porch every Saturday. The neighborhood was still well kept, still quiet, still the place he had researched and chosen deliberately. The gate had since been opened under the new easement terms, and cars moved through it freely every day. But every single person who drove through that entrance passed over 1 foot of land that belonged to Marcus Hale. And in that small fact lived the entire story of what patience, precision, and a dining room table covered in property records could accomplish when a quiet man finally decided he had been pushed far enough.